the Institute. Let me just say again, we're just so thrilled to have you. We hope you will find this webinar series useful. And we especially want the topics to be ones that are of interest to you. The first 3 topics are ones that we identified through a survey that we did last spring of people to find out what was of interest to local governments on resilience and climate issues. And these were the things that came up. We believe that one of the things that a university can do well is to bring people together for learning and to identify and bring experts to you to share their information. We will always welcome your suggestions for how to make this series more useful and for what topics to cover. A couple of logistical things. We're recording today's webinar, and a copy will be accessible on the ERI website. We have your email addresses, so we'll be able to communicate with you after the webinar to provide information about how to find that and for other things. Given the number of people on the webinar, we have everybody muted except for me, obviously. If you have a question you would like to have addressed, and we hope you will, you can metaphorically raise your hand by hovering your mouse over your screen, and you should see a little raise hand option in the webinar controls. You can also send a question through the chat function, and we will provide time at the end of the webinar for questions. We'll try by unmuting everyone at that time, but if it's too much of a free-for-all, we'll find some other way to do it. If you are having or find you have technical difficulties with this webinar, you can send a message through the chat box. If you don't have access to that, you can send an email to me at jgmccabe@iu.edu, and I will make sure that we do our best to try to help you with whatever technical difficulty you are having. This is our first one, so hopefully it will be bug-free, but I know that that's not always, you don't always get what you want on that. Let's go to slide 2. Okay, there we go. Our first topic today is environmental changes expected in Indiana. That was the #1 choice when we sent out our survey of suggested topics. I'm thrilled, and we're thrilled to have 2 people who, nobody in Indiana is better suited to talk to you about this topic than the 2 people we have on today. I will tell you a little bit about them now, and then they won't need to do that when it's time for their presentation. So first we'll hear from Melissa Widhalm. She is the program manager for the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which is a statewide collaborative effort to develop a series of reports to help Hoosiers better understand climate change related risks, what's coming in our state so that we can prepare for the future. Melissa oversees the development of a number of reports. She'll explain all those to you. She is a climate scientist with a degree in meteorology and a Master's of Science in Natural Resource Science. Our second presenter is Dr. Gabe Filippelli. He is Professor of Earth Sciences and Director of the Center for Urban Health at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, otherwise known as IUPUI. Gabe's work includes research on climate change impacts, on a broad array of them, with a particular focus on how our systems, terrestrial and marine systems, respond to climate change, so that it will help us understand how we will respond in the future to the climate changes that we are seeing. Dr. Filippelli is also involved in a number of public health related research projects, including lead poisoning, mercury, and other issues that affect us in our communities, especially children's health, and is a leader in the field of medical geology. He was the lead author for the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment's health report. So he is exactly the right person to be talking to us about that topic. So let's go to the next slide, Andrea. I wanted you all to see the wide array of people who had signed up to participate in this webinar today. So lots of interest out there, and thanks again for joining us. Let's go to the next one. I want to thank a couple of organizations that are co-sponsoring this with us. First of all, Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, or AIM. And you guys are, probably many of you are familiar with AIM. Nobody from there was able to be with us today, but they jumped on the opportunity to co-host this series with us. So we're thrilled to have their support with this. Let's go to the next one. Our other co-sponsor, who also couldn't be here with us today because they're having their annual conference, is the Association of Indiana Counties. We know that both city government and county government have a lot of questions, a lot of issues related to climate change, resilience, preparedness, that they want to find more information on about. So we want to make sure that we're making our programming available at all levels of local government. I also, as we go to the next slide, want to thank Indiana University, and in particular the Grand Challenges program, for the establishment of the Environmental Resilience Institute, which is the creator of this series. We are an organization at Indiana University that represents faculty, researchers, and others from all across the university, numerous disciplines, multiple campuses, all coming together to work in a cross-disciplinary way to research, understand, communicate, and serve the people and the communities in Indiana as we face changes from our changing climate and environmental changes across the state. We have a number of projects in particular that Andrea and I are working on that I'll just mention quickly, because especially we think they're of interest to cities and towns and local governments. One is that we collaborate with the IU Sustainability Office on a summer externship program called the Indiana Sustainability Development Program. That's a program where you can apply to get a undergraduate or graduate student to work for a summer on a sustainability project of your designing. So the more information will be available about that, but cities and others can apply by December 14th of this year. We'll be sure to get you information, or if you have questions, you can ask us. One really exciting thing this year that is related to that externship program is the Indiana Greenhouse Gas Inventory Cohort, which is a kind of jargony name, but basically one of the first things that a city can do to understand its resilience for climate change is to do a greenhouse gas inventory, get an understanding of energy use and other activities at the city or community level that are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And we are expecting to get funding to support a number of cities in Indiana, up to 15, developing a greenhouse gas inventory. You would have the ability to apply for an extern to help you do that, or simply apply and you could do it on your own. Andrea and I will be helping to coordinate that program, and we think this is a fantastic opportunity for Indiana cities. We already have 2 that have expressed very firm interest in doing this. Lastly, we are working on developing something called the Hoosier Resilience Index, which is intended to be an approach, a number, a scale to help Indiana communities get an understanding of how resilient they are to the kinds of climate change impacts that we're going to be seeing and that you're going to be hearing about in the next few minutes. So lots more to come on that as we move forward. Okay, let's go to the next one. And I think we are now ready to turn this over to Melissa Widhalm from Purdue University to talk about the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. I thought that I saw the unmute button pop up. I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, is that good? Can you see it? All right, we'll take that as a yes. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. And thank you especially to Janet and to Andrea for inviting me to be one of your speakers here today. I'm the operations manager with the Purdue Climate Change Research Center, and one of my main responsibilities at the moment is overseeing the development of the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. This is a multi-institutional partnership with experts and decision makers throughout the state with a primary goal of really answering that question, what does climate change mean for Indiana? So in the process of answering this question, we're also trying to increase awareness of and dialogue about climate change issues in our state. And as you can imagine, this is a bit of a challenge, since a lot of times when people hear the phrase climate change or global warming, they picture in their mind something like this: some poor polar bear floating away on a melting bit of ice at the far end of the earth. Or they imagine, some point in time that's very distant, far away, not here and now. And so the images that have been shown to us for years and the language that has been used has really made it difficult for us to see that climate change is an urgent local issue. In fact, just about 52% or so of Hoosier adults say that they're worried about climate change. To me, that's an alarmingly low number. Just 35% of Hoosier adults think that climate change will personally harm them. And as a result of all of this, climate change just isn't something that we've been prioritizing here in Indiana. Only about 31% of Hoosiers say that they occasionally talk about climate change. And so over the next very short 15 minutes that I have with you, I want to make the argument that climate change is a high priority for Indiana, and it's something we should be talking about, especially as we update our city plans and build tomorrow's drainage systems and plan for our community and our personal budgets. My hope is that over the next 15 minutes, instead, when you hear climate change, instead of what comes to mind as that polar bear, is replaced with something like this, with our family and our neighbors, and our health and our well-being, which Gabe will elaborate on here shortly. We need to think about our communities and our social and physical structures, the very things that make us Hoosiers. And yes, even our potholes. When we talk about climate change, these are the images that need to come to the forefront of our mind, because our scientists right here in our very own state have multiple lines of evidence that all point to the fact that our climate is changing. These changes are being driven by human activities. It's hurting Hoosiers. And these changes that we have measured over this last century will continue and intensify. These are the conclusions of Hoosier scientists. And yes, you heard me correctly, our climate is already changing. This is an issue for right here and right now. So when we look at temperature observations going back to the late 1800s, we see that our state's average annual temperature has already warmed about 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit. When people first hear that number, they might not think it's a big deal, but it's important to realize that the climate is a long-term average of our weather conditions. And these averages, especially over the course of something like a year, these average conditions are very stable. So when we start talking about a couple of degrees of change in the average, that translates to dramatic shifts in our day-to-day weather. Just consider that with this single degree of warming, we've already seen a growing season here in Indiana that's lengthened about 2 to 3 weeks over the last 50 years. We're seeing fewer extremely cold days compared to the past, and our overnight temperatures are rapidly warming. And it's not just temperature, we also see changes in our rainfall patterns. If we look at a statewide average of our annual rainfall, on an annual basis today, we get about 5 inches more rainfall than we did a century ago. And there's even larger increases when we go to the southern part of the state. And it's not just more total rain, but the nature of storms have shifted as well. Across the Midwest, our heaviest rainfall events have about 42% more volume in their rainfall now compared to the 1950s. And recent research shows that weather stations in Indiana are seeing a greater number of rainfall events that are 2 inches or more and 3 inches or more. So if it seems like these heavy rainfall events are changing, your perceptions match the data. And as we increase that total rainfall and we shift the patterns of heavy downpours, we see more flooding. There was a study that came out not too long ago that showed the magnitude of flooding here in Indiana has been increasing about 6 to 9% per decade since the 1920s. So looking back through the records, we know that Indiana is warming. We know it's becoming wetter. But what about looking forward? What kind of a future climate do we need to be planning for? With my remaining time here, I guess it's this afternoon now, I'm going to give you just a really brief look at what Indiana's top scientists are saying about our climate in the coming decades. And all of this information comes from the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment. So this is a statewide effort led by Purdue, but really conducted in partnership with over 100 experts across the state. This assessment is a bottom-up voluntary effort to provide Hoosiers with a trusted and accurate look at how our changing climate affects state and local interests. So we're doing this in part through developing a series of plain language reports on topics of high relevance to Hoosiers. So I won't read them off, you can see them here on the screen. We've released 6 reports since March of 2018, so March of this year. We'll have one more report coming out in November and the remaining reports coming out in early 2019. So if you're looking for additional information beyond the tiny little snapshot that I gave you today, or if you want to go dig into these reports in depth, you can find all of that information on our website at indianaclimate.org. Okay, so first let's take a look at temperature, and specifically Indiana's statewide average temperature, because it's really a helpful indicator and just the general trend in our overall climate. So what we're looking at here, that orange squiggly line, this is showing us how much above or below average each year has been going back to about 1900. And this thick black line overlaid on the top, this is showing the long-term trend in our state's average temperature, which we've already assessed that our state has warmed by about 1 degree. As we move to the right half of this graphic, we're looking at future temperature. These are projections. So for the Indiana assessment, we used 10 different climate models to look at future changes. Now, most of what I'll be reporting on is an average across those 10 simulations, but it's always important to keep in mind there is a range of future outcomes that are possible, but with some very clear and distinct patterns that emerge as well. So on the right half of this graphic, the red area is showing us the projected temperatures if we did nothing to reduce our emissions of heat-trapping gases from things like generating power and growing food and moving around our goods. The green area, on the other hand, reflects projected temperatures if globally we were to act pretty aggressively to reduce the emissions of heat-trapping gases. So that red area is sometimes called business as usual. That's the trajectory we're on now. So we kind of see that as the upper bound. And then we have a lower scenario that, rounds out that bottom side to give us a full range of possibilities. Now, based on the best available computer simulations, our scientists right here in Indiana have concluded that our state's annual average temperature is expected to increase by about 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. And that range really depends on our decision to slow or not slow our emissions of heat-trapping gases. This is a tremendous amount of warming. Now, there are two important takeaway messages here that I want to point out. So the first one is that based on the amount of heat-trapping gases that we already have in our atmosphere, even if we were to stop emitting today, we're going to continue to see changes in our climate. So if you focus on the warming trends in the coming decades up to about mid-century, you'll see that both outcomes are virtually the same. So our communities need to acknowledge that there is a fixed level of change in the system, and we need to start planning for it. We need to become resilient so we can deal with the changes that are coming. The second critical message is that we have a choice in our future, but that we must act urgently to reduce emissions if we want to avoid the most devastating impacts. After about the 2050s, after about mid-century, there is a significant difference in the outcomes. These are two very different futures that we are looking at. So to think about our future climate seasonally instead of annually, as we move through this century, we can expect our summer conditions to be more like states to our south and our west, and winter conditions to be more like states well to our east. Now, as I mentioned, when we shift the average, there are rippling effects in other variables. And this is a fantastic graphic that illustrates just this point. And what we're looking at is with just a few degrees of change, a small change in that average, it translates to a pretty significant shift in the occurrence of the extremes. And unfortunately for Indiana, it's the frequency and the intensity of extreme events that are going to become defining features in our future climate. So in the interest of time, I want to give you just one example of temperature extremes just to illustrate the magnitude of the changes that are underway. So here we're looking at the number of days each year. I picked Tippecanoe County, that's where I'm sitting right now in west central Indiana, and we're looking at the number of days where temperatures reach 90 or above. So it's not unheard of to hit 90. In fact, when we look at the past records, we can tell that we get about 20 days on average that meet this criteria. So conditions like this aren't unusual, but we can all attest to the discomfort that a hot day brings, and frankly, the danger it brings if you're somebody who works outdoors or if you don't have access to air conditioning. Those hot days tend to coincide with poor air quality, which can be dangerous or life-threatening if you have asthma or other chronic conditions. These are real impacts on real people. And it doesn't take unspeakably hot weather to start affecting our communities. Even reaching 90 starts to cause problems. So again, in the past, we would expect this about 20 times a year. If we fast forward to mid-century, now we're looking at 57 to 70 times per year where temperatures reach above 90. This is an extreme change that will affect all of us. Are we ready for this? Now, just as temperatures are projected to shift, so too is precipitation. So here now we're looking at statewide averages. And what our projections show is about a 6 to 8% increase in our annual rainfall. So keeping on trend with what we've been seeing in the past. But the real challenge is how these changes shake out seasonally, because this shift is not going to be distributed evenly throughout the year. What we're finding is that we're going to see sizable increases in rainfall during the winter and spring, which is a time of year we're already prone to flooding. And we really, frankly, just don't need more water. So this will push the limits of our stormwater systems and our flood control capabilities. And there's actually really high agreement across those 10 computer models when we look at winter and spring. This is a pretty certain projection. Now, for summer and fall, the models are a little bit less certain. Some of them show slight increases, some show slight decreases, and overall, by mid-century, when you average it out, we're looking at some modest declines at a time of year when we actually need the water for our crops and our wildlife and our drinking water. And so when you pair this with increasing temperatures and evaporation, it's going to lead to some serious water stress and possibly water shortages. So all of these shifts in our temperature and our precipitation patterns, it ultimately results in changes to our local hydrology. And that's going to mean we need new approaches to managing our water resources. So again, here I'm looking at West Central Indiana just for an example. By mid-century, we're looking at about a 6 to 8% increase in annual runoff. So that'd be the amount of water that's flowing into our rivers and streams, so flowing over the surface or coming out of drain pipes and entering our waterways. But just like with precipitation, we're finding distinct and important seasonal differences with increases in winter and spring and decreases in summer and fall. So these seasonal shifts will have major implications for our water quality. So our water's purity or the temperature, the oxygen levels. When water's of insufficient quality, which you can get when you got too much or too little runoff, you can have significant damage to wildlife, such as fish kills. You can have reductions in your power production capabilities, such as what happened in 2012 during the drought, when river temperatures in some places were too warm to take that water out for cooling towers. You can even lose your source of drinking water, like this. So this is what a harmful algal bloom looks like at a water supply intake in Lake Erie. So these are the types of consequences that we face as our weather changes. Now, I realize I've given you a lot of information in a very short amount of time, and there's so much more to go over. But let me just give you a quick recap on the high points here. We can look back at our records and we can find that our climate is already changing. We know we're getting warmer, we're getting wetter, and the best available science we have indicates that these trends are going to continue and intensify. In the coming decades, we're going to face new challenges, especially as it relates to extreme heat and heavy rainfall events. And if we want to effectively manage these climate and water risks, we're going to need to account for the seasonal shifts in addition to the annual trends. And most importantly, we need to remember that where we end up depends on the choices we make, and that we must act urgently. So finally, let me close with this. I want to tell you everything you should know about climate change in just 10 words. It's warming, it's us, it's bad. Experts agree, and there's hope. I know what I just shared is very depressing, it's a little bit overwhelming, and I really didn't get to talk about the important fact that there is hope. This is a solvable problem, and there are solutions to it. And there are people all across the world, even right here in Indiana, that are taking action. More Hoosiers than ever before are starting to pay attention to this issue. We have an army of experts in our universities that are working to put data-driven solutions into the hands of our communities and our decision makers. We have an active group of young people throughout the state that are pushing their mayors and their city councilmen and women to reduce emissions. We just had our 3rd annual mayor-led climate leadership summit right here in Indiana. So yes, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we should never forget there is hope. We can do this. All right, well, thank you so much for your attention. That time really flew by, and I didn't get to go over everything I would love to go over with everybody, so please be sure to visit indianaclimate.org. My contact information is up there as well if you have any questions today or any time in the future. And I guess I will turn it over so we can hear from Gabe.
Actually, before we do that, let me just jump in to say thank you to Melissa. Every time I hear you talk about this, it's better, it's clearer, it's got more information. I want to emphasize how useful the Purdue website is, and that there are very understandable and clear summaries of each of the chapters of the report on that website that I know you would find useful. So with that, we will turn to Dr. Gabe Filippelli to hear about the health impacts associated with some of the issues that Melissa has just talked about.
Well, thank you very much. This is Gabe, and I'm very happy to have an opportunity to follow along with what Melissa already presented. And I think one of the great assets of this particular approach to climate assessments is that it doesn't just put climate out there on a limb, let's say, and say climate is simply changing and here's how it's changing, but rather we're able to downsize, or I'd say right size, our approach to figuring out the most vulnerable sectors, and because we're able to do that, we are able to develop solutions to some of the most pressing challenges that climate change will impose on us. I was a lead author of one of the chapters on Hoosiers' health, and this is particularly critical because, of course, we care a lot about our health. We live in our bodies, and we care a lot about our health, obviously. And the results from the climate change assessment spoke to a number of aspects that were important to examine in the health realm. So we covered and focused on those that seem most related to the obvious impacts of climate change in the Indiana perspective. And that, of course, includes the temperature variations that Melissa provided us with, as well as the rainfall variations. So in that context, we examined insect-borne illnesses, water-based problems, including flooding and damage and death from flooding, heat-related illnesses and injuries, air quality, mental health, and particularly those populations that are most vulnerable to the impacts. For this particular presentation, I will focus on insect-borne illnesses, heat-related illnesses and injuries, air quality, and vulnerable populations. I'm also a climate change scientist, and one of the things that I've spoken about quite a bit in the past is that climate change isn't a conjectural future, it's a real now, and I think Melissa showed that well. Climate change has already occurred. We've seen it when you talk to older people who are lifelong Hoosiers, they will report these differences. One of the key differences is the nature of our precipitation. The precipitation has already increased somewhat toward the recent past, but probably the most critical part is that the extreme precipitation events have increased substantially over the last 50 years. And that means flooding. Big cities have already had to deal with this, and unfortunately, because big cities are built on very strong infrastructures, it's hard to redesign them to accommodate basically getting a lot of water off of a very flat landscape very quickly. Indianapolis is going through a very large storm sewer conversion right now to deal with this problem. And the projections show that it is only going to continue. And so I'm going to walk through some of these things. For example, that the projections of more flooding, or at least even the past history of more flooding, combined with the warmer winters we've experienced, would likely lead to an expansion of vector-borne disease. So these are a fancy word for saying largely diseases carried by pests, mosquitoes and ticks. And in fact, that's exactly what we've seen. Even over the last 26 years, we've seen a significant increase in mosquito populations in Indianapolis, and that's most related to ponded water and warmer conditions, and also a much longer growing season for these pests. It's also reflected in an explosion of Lyme disease across the Northeast and Midwest part of our country. In 1996, this was the picture of Lyme disease diagnoses. And you could see that even by 2014, it's increased substantially. For now, Indiana has not suffered from the extent of Lyme disease expansion that some areas have, largely because our deer population tend to be confined to forests, and we've managed in some parts of our state to cut many of those down. Nevertheless, it's problematic. The mosquitoes are particularly an issue because conditions already exist in Indiana for a number of the worst kinds of mosquito diseases like West Nile and even Zika. So it doesn't take more than one bellwether individual who happens to have Zika or West Nile or even dengue fever to cause an explosion of this disease. One of the drivers, the key driver of climate change, is an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmospheres, the greenhouse gases. And not only does carbon dioxide cause increased temperature, but weeds love carbon dioxide. In fact, experiments and studies that were conducted by IUPUI professors showed that one of those species that absolutely love carbon dioxide are poison ivy. And so that's just an indicator that carbon dioxide enhances the growth of some plant species, a limited number of them, and many of them are plants that we would consider nuisance plants. So not only do weeds like the increased concentration of carbon dioxide, they also love a longer growing season. And this is related to these triggers, these pollen triggers that people with asthma or other allergies, pollen-related allergies, suffer from. And these diseases have increased exponentially in Indiana. So those were kind of a combination of water and temperature. I'm going to focus in for a little bit on temperature only. One of the advantages of looking forward with this climate assessment is we're actually able to examine climate change in particular locations. And this is the projection for one of those locations, and this is in Indianapolis, where in the past, we've only had a handful of days over 95 degrees. I pick 95 degrees because that is the physiological heat tolerance level for human beings, for our kind of organism. And you go much above that level for very long, and you have problems. As you see, projecting in the future, it goes from these different scenarios, just reflect the different emission scenarios. But it gets as bad as having a month to 2.5 months by the 2080s of temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Cities, and this effect is exacerbated in cities. And I should have mentioned that in Evansville, for example, that projection is about 100 days over 95 degrees. But cities produce their own temperature by having a lot of heat-absorbing materials like concrete and asphalt. And hence there is a well-studied, well-recorded heat island effect, such that even if the general baseline for temperature in Indiana is 90 degrees, in cities like Indianapolis or Evansville or even smaller cities, the temperature is going to be about 5 degrees or more warmer than that. This projection kind of shows the texture, the fabric of heat in a city. What this also shows is the ways one solves some of this problem, or at least mitigates it somewhere. You notice this depression in temperature increase over parks. Trees and natural spaces tend to not promote this heat island effect. And it points to ways you can strategically plant these parks or trees in such a way to mitigate the impacts in some areas. Urban heat islands are also related to ozone production. There's a very strong linear relationship between temperature and ozone. So whereas temperature causes heat stress in people, ozone actually causes significant pulmonary damage, so lung damage. We know the cause. There's some natural ozone that's present because plants make it as part of the precursor part, I should say. But fuel emissions are a big culprit. And when you have a combination of a city with high temperatures and a lot of mobile sources of combusting fuel, you have a significant increase in ozone. A number of additional health impacts emerged from this study for Hoosiers. One is that there's been a significant increase in the number of algal blooms due to warmer temperatures. And particularly, it's interesting, these algal blooms seem to have been recently turning on this function, this genetic function that makes them produce a toxin, so cyanotoxins. And when you consider that some of our reservoirs, for example, all of them in Indianapolis, are drinking water reservoirs, it becomes a real problem for water managers. We also reflected to some extent on flood-related injuries and death, and the fact that the emerging literature that shows that these disturbances, environmental disturbances, create a tremendous amount of stress in individuals, and even post-traumatic stress disorder emerging from these in the long term. And finally, we talked directly about heat-related illness and death, and I'm gonna turn attention to that in the last couple slides. And one is that in general, we can project how many net deaths there are from temperature-related factors in Indiana, and this is actually just in one county, Indianapolis. You could project that heat or cold in 1990 would have killed about 33 people in the city. Most of these projections now into 2100 show that number increases significantly, up to maybe 80 or so deaths. And almost all of them now are projected to be hot heat-related deaths rather than freezing, which also kind of lends itself to understanding the nature of why temperature causes this and what's the past history. Well, a great example is from Chicago that had a tragic example, I should say, which had a heat, basically a heat event during July in 1995, and that's that squiggly green plot. And you could see that as heat peaked in about July 11th, there's about a 1 day to 2 day delay in that, and then you got this huge peak in deaths, human deaths. And that's related to largely those vulnerable populations, and they simply could not maintain their temperature enough, so they often go into cardiac arrest or other diseases. You can see that even subsequent hot days, you see that after that peak, didn't result in the same deaths, and that's because, to be quite blunt, those most vulnerable populations individuals were likely killed off in that first heat event, and so they weren't present a little bit later on. And that speaks to who is at greatest risk. Well, elderly and infants, elderly usually because of accumulation of various diseases, and sometimes the way that they live, you can imagine maybe a low-income elderly person in an apartment without air conditioning. They get no heat relief. Infants as well, low-income people for the factor I mentioned earlier, and those with pre-existing conditions. And interestingly, heat deaths are related also to pets and pigs. For air quality itself, there are a number of those who are greatest risk. So air quality means a combination of ozone and particulate matter. And those are people who suffer from asthma already, and those with chronic lung diseases where their lung capacity is already compromised, or their airways are in some way compromised. And as you can see from the past plots on climate impacts, this is going to be more of an issue in the future. So to turn to some of the solutions, which I promised you right toward the beginning, addressing some of the root causes of climate change will reduce health impacts in Indiana. And I think that's largely doing things like we're doing right this very moment, which is increasing the dialogue. It's why you guys all signed up for the webinar, to talk about it, to hear about it, and to learn about it. The second one is, of course, dialogue. Talk is talk, but then action has to come from it, and it should be intelligent action to adopt policies and personal practices that look forward rather than look back. And I think this climate assessment showed us a great roadmap of how you look forward. And finally, take some actions to limit climate change. Now, there's one direct way, which is to limit warming and exposure, and that's mitigation, and that's reducing the emissions of these heat-trapping gases and modifying cities, so urban greening to reduce the heat island effect. And there's also policy initiatives. I know Janet McCabe, who's one of the ones leading this, was a champion of developing some of these air and water, or particularly air in her case, but air and water quality standards to reduce the impact. But frankly, as Melissa showed, climate change is here. It's already occurred, and it's going to continue to occur because of our carbon hangover. So there are ways to adapt, and inevitably we have to adapt to prepare for some of these impacts. One of these is, of course, emergency response planning. Chicago put into place a heat wave response team after that heat wave that killed so many people, to develop intelligent ways to provide cooling centers and to increase community scale resilience, particularly in the vulnerable communities. There's, of course, infrastructure improvements. Remember, when you build a sewer or you build a major roadway, you're building it for 20 or 50 years. And so you're kind of already building in, you should be building in climate as a part of that. And finally, it's to increase surveillance and remediation. Certainly some of these things like algal blooms are understudied, and pests and pest distributions can be addressed if the habitats for them can be mitigated. So all of these are ways to decrease the impact. And with that, I'll turn it right back over to the organizers.
Thanks so much, Gabe. That was great, and hopefully it was interesting and good information for people. I'm going to say a couple quick things before we open it up for questions in case people need to start dropping off. So I'm going to again thank our speakers. I'm going to thank AIM and Indiana Association of Indiana Counties for helping to put this on, as well as the Environmental Resilience Institute and the Grand Challenges. We will be holding a webinar like this each month. We have October and November scheduled. Unlike today, which is a Thursday, the standard day will be the second Tuesday of every month. Our topic next month is flooding, and I know a lot of people are interested in that. There will be a recording available of today's webinar on the ERI website. So we hope that if you found this interesting and you think others will be interested, you will share the link with them and let them know about this series so that they can sign up for future webinars. Specifically to Melissa's discussion, the Climate Change Impacts Assessment organization can provide and will provide county-specific fact sheets. So you can get a fact sheet for your county that shows expected number of more days over 90 degrees, expected precipitation changes. These are incredibly useful short documents that are specific to your county, and those will be available, I believe, next week, and we will make sure that you get an email that tells you where and how to find access to those. We'd love for you to give us feedback on the webinar series as a whole, on specific topics you'd like to see, on specific speakers that you'd like to suggest that we reach out to participate. I think that a lot of the information that you heard today was very real, very realistic, and in some senses grim, but I am so pleased that both of our speakers emphasized that there are things that we can and should be doing here. These are not problems that we can't address. We've done it in this country before with significant challenges, including significant environmental challenges. And we can do it again here. And the Environmental Resilience Institute, Purdue, many other organizations are coming together to figure out solutions and how to work with people in order to make progress on these issues. So with that, one other thing, we will make sure that you're all on our newsletter mailing list. We have a newsletter we put out a couple of times a year to primarily local officials, but anybody's welcome to get our newsletter with information about upcoming events and interesting things going on. So with that, Andrea, maybe we can unmute people and see if there are any questions for Melissa, for Gabe, or for anybody else.
But I doubt it, because they would have asked me, you know.
I'm back now. Yep. Good, thank you. Yeah.
Has anybody got a question? Are we unmuted, Andrea?
Yes, we are unmuted. I believe Chan has a question. So go ahead, Chan.
Hello, can I make?
Yep, we can hear you. You're a little soft.
Hello,
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I have a question for Melissa. So in the presentation, you have a lot of different scenario for future.
It's all right.
Where did you get the data, the future climate in Indiana? What climate data did you use for those projections?
Sure. So we worked with Alan Hamlet at the University of Notre Dame, and him and his students and postdocs had done quite a bit of work downscaling the CMIP-5 data. So they went through a process to scale it down from the full suite of models down to 10 representative models. And I'm happy to send you some references to their information and their methods if you have questions beyond that. I'm not a climate modeler by training, and so I would defer to him on the details, but I do know they use the CMIP-5 and they downscaled that, and they do have a couple of papers that have been published on their methods.
Okay. I mean, the reason I'm asking because here we at ERI, we also plan to run future climate projection using the same CMIP-5 product. We try to do for 3 different scenarios. And I don't know, I was working with INCCIA before, but now we want to do similar thing, and I just don't know, you know, how did you design all of this stuff, the detail? Maybe you can send me an email, then I can talk offline about how did you do it, because we may contribute the same, we may provide you a set of future projection from our own experiment.
Sounds like
Sure, I believe I have your email, so I'm happy to, after the webinar is completed, send you a message and loop Alan into it and make sure you two are connected.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sounds like a great opportunity. Are there other questions?
Oh, we had one question come in via the chat, and that is, what is being done to combat flooding of lagoons in CAFOs in Indiana? Now remember, CAFOs stands for Condensed Agricultural Feeding Operation, so farms with lots of animals, essentially.
Gabe or Melissa, did either of you want to take a crack at that?
I don't have an answer to that.
And I don't either. I know that they are obviously, I think the question is right, dead on. It's a huge, I mean, it's obviously a health issue, might be more of an ecosystem health than necessarily a direct human health impact, although I wouldn't discount that either. We've seen so many failures of some of these systems when it's flooding. In fact, you know, Hurricane Florence is already showing this stat this very moment. So it's certainly of a priority, but I'm sorry, I don't have exact information for the state on that.
Yeah, I think there was an article in the New York Times this week showing photos of lagoons in North Carolina that were overtopping as a result of the flooding. So clearly a cat issue we should be concerned about. Are there any other questions?
So we did have to mute everybody on the call, so you'll have to unmute yourself if you have a question, but you're certainly welcome to do that.
I have a question. This is Melissa. Who is your speaker for your next webinar? You mentioned the topic, but I didn't hear who it was.
Good question. So you've mentioned him already. Alan Hamlet from Notre Dame is going to be on talking about flooding. And as Melissa said, he has been very involved in the Indiana Climate Change Impacts Assessment on water issues. We're also going to have Donna Price from the city of Indianapolis, who has been responsible for a number of things related to zoning and flood mapping and planning around the flood-prone areas in Indianapolis, to talk about the ways the city of Indianapolis has approached in recent years anticipating changes in flooding. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sounds like there's a little mouse running around in the web somewhere. Let's do one more chance for people to put their hand up.
So I will say that it's possible that Claire Whalen is trying to ask a question, but that's the sort of mouse sound that we're hearing. So I have been muting you, Claire, because the sound is a little distracting. But feel free to enter a question through the chat box as well.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody again. Hopefully we can institute a culture of starting and ending on time, or even a minute or two early. So we'll do that today by ending at 12:58. We hope to see you back here again next month. And please do be in touch with us or our speakers if you have further questions about this material or the series or anything else that we can try to help you with related to climate change, resilience, mitigation, public health, and these very, very important issues. And thanks to everything that you all do in your jobs every day to help make our Hoosier communities safer and healthier.